A world without prisons. I want to ask you to take a moment to imagine that world, or a few moments. How does this world make you feel? Do you feel a bit scared? Do you feel intrigued? What exists in place of prisons in this world? Can you imagine anything that exists in their place? In our world, Aotearoa, New Zealand, 2019, we have one of the highest prison population rates in the OECD. A big part of the reason for this is that we incarcerate Māori at a rate almost 6 times that of Pākehā. Māori men make up 53% of our prison population, and Māori women 63%. Māori are also more likely to be charged and imprisoned than Pākehā for any crime. It's hard to avoid the conclusion that our justice system is profoundly and systematically racist. Now, there are probably as many ideas about what Aotearoa New Zealand represents in this room as there are people. But I doubt that any of us feel proud that we represent a country more prone to locking people up than anyone else in the OECD except the United States, Turkey, and Israel. Now, by virtue of being in this room, I think you're the kind of people who are interested in new ideas and new ways of thinking. What's really interesting is that even amongst people who might have the most invested in our current punitive justice system, there's already this growing awareness that prisons are not the solution to our social problems. In August of last year, I was one of 600 people attending the government's Criminal Justice Summit down the road in Porirua, New Zealand. I was there in my capacity as the director of Mead, the organisation that I work for. It was not a gathering of radical prison abolitionists. Many of the people there work in the justice system as lawyers, prosecutors, corrections staff, police officers. Many people who've been victims of crime were also represented, as well as those who support them through the system. But on the second day, this insane thing happened. We were asked to imagine what the front page of the newspaper would say in the year 2040, when we had achieved all the change that we had desired for our criminal justice system, when we had made it safe and effective for everyone. What would that look like? We were broken up into different groups representing all the diverse people who were at this conference. And one by one, people representing these groups got up on stage. And one by one, they unfolded the front page of this newspaper in 2040. And on nearly every single one, it said some version of January the 1st, 2040, the last prison in Aotearoa closes. They imagined, they celebrated a world without prisons. What did that look like to you? See, to me, it feels like it would look like we'd build a community where we didn't respond to harm by creating more harm, but instead we modeled the behaviour that we want to see. Instead of asking why anyone should be locked up or go free, we've asked ourselves, what would transform the conditions in which we know that harm is most likely to occur? Why, as a society, would we choose to model cruelty and vengeance when we are capable of so much more? Because the truth is that, as a society, prisons are not a place that we should want to exist. Let me draw you a parallel. Let's say that I've come up with a radical solution to deal with cancer, the greatest healthcare challenge of them all. It's necessary, I say to you, to take radical action to eliminate the scourge for once and for all. But then you find out that this radical solution I'm proposing, it won't actually cure anyone. It'll make a whole bunch of people more sick. And it will cost us billions of dollars, significantly more than the alternatives. The truth is that investing in prisons, we're investing in a system like this. One that's proven to increase crime, increase reoffending, create trauma for communities and families, and cost us billions and billions of dollars. As Professor Tracy McIntosh say, prisons are fully funded failure. Now, many of us might struggle with what kind of alternative we would build. But the truth is that incarceration is best understood as a solution to social problems and social inequalities that the rest of our health and education and social services have failed to address. In 2016, the Department of Corrections' own research found that 91% of people in our prisons have had a mental health or addiction disorder. People in our prisons in Aotearoa are twice as likely to have thought about suicide and 4 times as likely to have attempted it. 75% of women in our prisons have experienced sexual or family violence. And 63% of people in prison, a rate that's almost as high as 90% for Māori, have experienced a traumatic brain injury, the consequences of which are known to have severe knock-on effects for impulse control, decision-making, as well as creating serious mental and physical trauma. Now, I think we can all agree that when a harm is committed, there should be consequences and a process of accountability. But we can probably also agree that we would want that process of accountability to be effective, right, to prevent future harm. The problem with our punitive system that's centred around prisons is that they fail to deter crime. Moreover, once someone is sentenced to prison in Aotearoa, it has not only failed to decrease the chances of them reoffending, in many cases it will increase it. Now, one other thing we can probably agree on is that when the justice system does intervene in someone's life, it should do what it can to address the drivers of their offending, right? Again, to prevent more harm. Particularly if we understand, as we do, that lots of harm is driven by social issues around mental health and addiction. But community-based programs are significantly more effective at addressing those causes of harm. And the rehabilitation programs that are offered in prison, any good that they are do is often profoundly undermined by the overcrowding and the trauma and the violence that are really common experiences for many people in our prisons. For vulnerable young people, our justice system sets up these patterns really early on in their lives. 90% of young people who come before the youth court for a serious harm have been at some point have had a care and protection record. So at some point in time, someone has raised a really serious concern about violence or neglect for them or their family. And children with a parent in prison are 8 to 10 times more likely to go to prison themselves. When you zoom out on the system and look at it from above, it's kind of as if we've set up some of the most vulnerable people in our society to fail, and then we've continued to punish them when they do. I think one of the hardest things about imagining an alternative system, about building an alternative system, is imagining it. What filled the place of prisons in your imagination when you thought about it before? What's really interesting in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is that we don't have to look that far back into our history to see examples of what these alternatives might look like. Prior to colonisation, processes of accountability when harm occurred were incredibly important to Māori communities. But prisons were an alien concept. People who committed harm were dealt with by the community that they belonged to and the communities that they affected, with input from everyone involved. As constitutional lawyer Matua Moana Jackson puts it, the goal of the law was to restore whakapapa in its broadest sense of an interrelationship between peoples and between people and their environment. And reconciliation was the logical conclusion of that process. It's a process that puts meaningful accountability, being accountable to the people who matter the most to you, and the restoration of relationships front and centre. What's interesting about our current colonial system is that the restoration of relationships and the ability to heal from harm that you've experienced or caused fall to the bottom of the priority list because punishment comes first. no one benefits from this system. Not victims of crime, not people who commit harm, or not, as we've discussed, the many people who fall into that grey zone between those two groups. And Māori, whose rights, whose land, and whose processes of accountability were completely torn apart by colonisation, are the most affected as victims, not just as people overrepresented in our prisons. So, to me, it makes profound sense to look back at these processes of accountability and restoration to understand how we might start to fix our broken system. Now, for sure, our current society is really different from pre-colonial Māori communities in some really important and distinct ways. But what's interesting is that there are already these amazing examples in our justice system. We are already approaching this idea of, when we intervene, do no further harm. Our youth justice system is based on restorative justice principles. And one of its major priorities is deterring young people from entering into the adult criminal justice system at all. It's been so successful in this that it has decreased the number of young people offending by between 1/2 and 2/3 over the past decade. When a young person does commit a crime and they come before the court, they often referred to what's called a family group conference, a restorative justice process where the young person who is offended, their whānau and their family, members of their community, social workers, and the victim of their crime come together for a facilitated discussion about how that person can repair the harm that they've caused and what they need to not reoffend again. Some of the people who benefit the most from this restorative justice process are victims. They report a substantially higher satisfaction rate with this process than they do with the adversarial and punitive model that is a central part of our adult justice system. It's not all doom and gloom. There are some really good examples in our adult justice system where we are trying to apply these same ideas. Te Ao Oranga in Northland is an initiative that lets the police and healthcare agencies, along with NGOs, work together to help people who are suffering from methamphetamine addictions or who's supplying it. They refer people to the health agencies instead of to the courts so that they can get the help that they need to kick their habit. In its first year, it's been so successful that 120 people who weren't previously known to health agencies have now made contact with them and are getting help. Auckland's alcohol and other drug courts allows people whose offending is driven by their addiction to be referred to a community-based drug rehabilitation provider instead of prison. So, if we can acknowledge that these alternatives exist and that they work, I can feel us all asking, what's the holdup? And a big part of it is us. Public attitudes are perceived as, or may in fact be, a huge barrier to change in our criminal justice system. Many of us have never entered a courtroom, let alone a prison cell, but we have inherited really fixed ideas about what works to prevent crime and what accountability looks like. And a lot of these ideas are understandably based on fear, that we have for ourselves and our loved ones. But what's interesting is that it feels like those of us who are least likely to experience crime have the most fear and think that crime is on the rise when it's actually decreasing. In Aotearoa, the people least likely to experience crime are Pākehā, wealthy, and older. And what's really interesting is that it seems like the more that we invest in the kind of punitive justice policies that have led us to have this record high prison population, is that they seem to make us more scared. If we compare ourselves to Finland, who has a similar population size and a similar crime rate, which is low, but a prison population that is the quarter the size of ours. When surveyed, New Zealanders are a lot more scared than Finns. More scared, not less. And we have to acknowledge that politicians have routinely manipulated this fear that we feel for their own political gain, but for our community's loss and for the profound loss of people with first-hand interaction of these failed systems. So if we're going to start building this world that we have all imagined today, this world without prisons, one of the first things I think we need to start reimagining is ourselves. What we fear and who we fear and why. I often think about those 600 people in that conference in Porirua. No one walked into the room that day thinking that they were going to set out a plan to abolish prisons. And that moment when we talked about what kind of world we'd be proud of in 2040, it felt like this blip, this moment of clarity amongst what was mostly a discussion about the hurt and the anger and frustration that we felt about our current failed system. It felt like a blip, but actually I think those 600 people were just the beginning. Thank you.